So I've had my Galaxy Z Fold 4 for about a month now, and I've used it, I would say, the majority of the time. Some of you may think I'm crazy, but I have gone back to my Surface Duo 2 a few days. I've kind of gone back and forth a little bit, but for the last week or so, I've been pretty much full-time back on the Z Fold 2. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what it's like to have used this device for 1 month. Now, obviously, I've already posted a full review of this device, but there are always things that you're not going to see in the first few days or even the first week that maybe a month in you're going to finally kind of come across. And that's the stuff we're going to talk about in this longer term 1 month review. So let's start things off talking about the actual body of this device. Now, I do have a case on mine. I'm not going to pop off this front bit because it is somewhat adhered to it with a weak adhesive, but I will pop off the back so that you can see the color and so forth there on the back. I really do like the build quality of this device. Without the case on, it is extremely slippery and hard to hold on to. A case for me is normally not something I want to do. Here it is an absolute necessity. This is the gray-green color, and I think that my camera is doing a pretty good job of picking up exactly what it does look like in person. Pretty big set of camera bumps here. You actually have a bump and then 3 little bumps that actually extend out even further. And probably the most annoying part about that is I have a couple of dogs and I get little dog hairs sort of all around these little camera bumps, and that's a little bit annoying. The cover display definitely does benefit from being a little bit wider. It's not a huge difference, but it is a little bit wider than it was before. It is a 120 hertz display up front as well, which is very, very nice. This cover display, I still wish this whole device was shorter and wider, and that would make this a lot easier to use. But as it stands now, it is generally okay for, doing things like scrolling through Twitter or even responding to a quick text message. But of course, the inside is where it's at. And that hinge is very stiff. The magnets, I should say, are very, very strong. So without a case on, it's actually difficult to open this thing. Let me put my case back on to kind of aid with that a little bit because it is very, very stiff. A strange thing before I get to the screen is that if it's been closed for a while, when I open it, I don't think this is going to be audible to you, but on that first open, there is a sort of weird sound that takes place. It doesn't quite sound like crunching, but kind of almost like crunching, and it's been there since day one and nothing's happening, so I don't know what to make of that, but it is there. This is the inside display, though, and this is kind of where all the action is. Before anybody in the comments says, oh, that's a Z Fold 3, I know I have this actually manually turned on. I don't like the way that the under display camera looks. It shimmers and it hurts my eyes, so I have it filled with black. This is a Z Fold 4. Calm down. I know you're out there just waiting to type that comment. It's a Fold 4. But this inner display is fantastic. I mean, it is 120 hertz. It's big. It's relatively bright. It's very colorful. The screen protector is probably the biggest problem I have with it. It's sort of a little bit sticky. It doesn't feel like glass. It's not as smooth. It doesn't glide like glass does. And the result is that you can see how many fingerprints are all over this thing. Lint sticks to it, little fuzz sticks to it. Fingerprints are impossible to keep off of this thing. Now, whenever the screen is on and you're not outside in bright lighting, you're not going to see all that. But if it is in a brightly lit area or the screen is off or you're looking at something that's very dark, you are going to see those fingerprints. But I would not recommend peeling that screen protector off at this point. I think it's still better to be there than not. Yes, the crease is still here. Now, like I've said a million times, unless you're looking at it off axis, you're not going to see the crease. When you're looking at it straight on, you're just not going to see it, okay? Maybe on a really dark screen, but again, you're going to need to be off axis. I'll show you, even when it's turned off, if you're straight on, it's not the easiest thing in the world to see. You can see it sort of in the reflection of the camera there. But when that screen is on, it goes away. Now, that being said, you can feel it. It is clearly right there. There is a little bit of a dip in the screen. This is something that your mileage may vary on. Are you going to be bothered by this? Are you going to be fine with this? I worried I'd be bothered by this when I got my first Fold 2. It is not something that bothers me at all. In terms of the rest of the hardware, you do have a volume rocker and a power button with the fingerprint scanner built into it, and it does work really well. You'll see here how quickly this does unlock. And that is absolutely fine. To me, this is the right solution. Rather than having an in-display fingerprint scanner there and then another one inside, just having one scanner in one place that is really reliable and works well is a fine solution. The camera setup here is, let me make sure I'm getting this right. It's a 50 megapixel primary. I don't know what order they're actually in, so I'm not going to point to them. 50 megapixel primary. There is a 12 megapixel ultra wide and a 10 megapixel 3x telephoto. I will show you some samples of these cameras here in just a little bit. It is a 4400 milliamp hour battery, 25 watt charging, Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1, 12 gigs of RAM. Now, obviously, this thing is a bit of a brick, right? It's very, very thick. This is not your Surface Duo 2, which, you know, maintains a very thin sort of body. This thing is very, very thick. So a lot of people have wondered, how is this thing to actually keep in your pocket? Well, the case that I am using is sort of slippery, and that does help. No case is going to make it even better. Honestly, it's not that bad going in and out of the pocket. It seems to be generally okay. You're going to know that the thing is in there. It is 263 grams, which is very heavy for a typical smartphone, but it, you know, opens up into a tablet. So this is not a typical smartphone. Pocketability does seem to be okay. I think that the hinge, I mentioned that it is very stiff and that the magnets are very strong. You can hear every time it closes, it is a very loud clunk sound that it does make. The hinge is good, right? It does stay in pretty much whatever posture you put it in. Reminds me of Duo a little bit in that sense. Something I didn't really mention in my other review that is in terms of this hardware are the stereo speakers. They are very, very good. This is going to be, if you buy this thing, probably of any smartphone you've owned, this is probably going to have the best, loudest speakers, and you do have one up top and one down below, so you do get stereo separation. Because it's such a large device, you truly do get actual separation. You can hear left and right channels. It is a very rich, full sound. I'll do a quick audio sample here. You can see here the distance here of the microphone. I mean, that is a very full, very rich, balanced sound. And if you have something like this case that has a kickstand on it, which is what that is, this thing makes a great little mobile viewing setup with this large screen. Granted, if you are watching most video content, you are going to have very large black bars when you are in full screen, which you will see right here. So this is fine. You got your comments, whatever, your recommended videos down here. But once you do rotate and go full screen, there are your bars, and you could zoom in a little bit, but you can see how much stuff you're going to be losing there on the sides. That is something to keep in mind. The screen is closer to square than it is to widescreen in a lot of ways. After 1 month of carrying this thing almost every single day, it's holding up really well, okay? The crease is not currently getting any worse. The hinge is not loosening. Nothing has really changed. The only thing I've really noticed is that that screen protector picks up an absolute ton of fingerprints and dust. And that is, like I said earlier, a little bit annoying. In terms of performance, this thing is lightning fast. This Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 is very, very good. Everything you do just is snappy. The animations are smooth. Really no complaints at all with the performance. I don't do any mobile gaming, but in the test, the brief tests I have done, it performs extremely well. I have seen at least some bugs. For instance, you know, your taskbar down here will sometimes just not appear. Like I've had it before where, you know, you've opened it up and the most recent apps over here on the right should be there and actually aren't right now for some reason. So count that as a little bit of a bug. But sometimes they show up, but then the apps at the bottom don't. And the only way I've seen to fix this is to actually go into the setting and turn the taskbar off and then back on. And that does seem to fix it. I'm not really sure why. Okay, now we have a recent app. I don't know why that wasn't showing up. We do have apps open in the background. But sometimes that taskbar is a little bit weird, but it is still very, very nice to have, right? So let's grab an application here like YouTube and drag it up onto the screen. That's a pretty cool thing to be able to do. And I do find myself using the taskbar sometimes, you know, maybe not as often to drag an app up to split screen, but more often than not just to actually switch apps or to go into my app drawer and to launch another app without having to actually swipe up to go home. And to do it, I find myself not using this sidebar at all. I probably haven't pulled that thing out in a week for whatever reason. I've just mentally fully gone to this one. Maybe it's because it's always visible down there, but that has been the case for me. So in terms of multitasking, though, even though it is really nice to be able to, you know, quickly drag an application up there, I will say that I find myself using this functionality far less than I did on my Duo 2. I multitask way less here than I do on a dual screen device. And part of that is because there is an additional step needed, right, to drag that app up there, and that's definitely in the way. Another thing is that I just generally don't like the way that it functions, where if I need to, let's say this is a note-taking app and this is something I'm taking notes with, I'm going to have the keyboard across the entire screen. I know that I could use the floating keyboard. I understand. I don't like the floating keyboard though, but when I open up the keyboard, I'm going to get it across both screens. Now I'm occluding a little bit of both applications, and that annoys me a little bit. You also have the fact, let's say I'm interacting with this app. Now I want to go back on this app. If I swipe to go back, I'm actually going to go back on the last app I used. That is a little bit weird. So the independence of the gestures is something that I really miss as well. Like I've said before, this is the best multitasking phone available if you don't include Surface Duo. But there is a pretty big gap for me between the two. So I mentioned the camera hardware earlier. Let's take a moment out and look at some photo samples of a trip that we took to Seven Islands Birding Park here just east of Knoxville, Tennessee. So with the primary lens, everything tends to be pretty detailed, quite colorful. You get that typical Samsung saturation going on. And I think it looks pretty good. So another example here, notice how colorful this is. Notice the contrast as well. Look at in these darker areas, the shadows on these plants. I really like the separation that you get from these very contrasty, very saturated photos. Using the telephoto at 3x, I think it still does a pretty good job. I really like the way that some of these leaves are backlit, some of them are in shadow, but you still get a pretty good amount of detail in these darker areas. And you can punch this zoom in pretty far. It's hard for me to describe how far away this was, but this was all the way at 30x, and I think it actually does a pretty serviceable job, even at 30x. Is it a great picture? No, not really, but I was able to see details in this photo that I couldn't see with my own eye because of how far away that actually was. A really good example of the versatility of this camera setup is this. We have our ultra-wide lens here, which does okay. Once you zoom in a bit, you do lose some detail. It's not the most amazingly detailed camera in the world, but I think if you look right here, you're going to be able to kind of see where we're going with this. There is a bird right in there. I believe this is a heron down there in the water. Now we're going to go to the standard lens, which I think is clearly the better looking picture. But now, you zoom in and that bird is not real visible. But then we do have that telephoto, which lets us punch in pretty doggone far to be able to really make out some detail on that bird. You can see its head and its beak. And then going in a full 30x to try and get some details. So we went from something like this, which, look, we're in 30x. It's not phenomenal, but you can see the bird pretty well, all the way back to this. So that is pretty impressive if you ask me. In terms of selfies, you have that under display camera, which just doesn't do a very good job. Look how kind of grainy this is. And I'm lit really well. I'm sitting in front of a ring light, and there's just some not such good stuff going on there. And then the non under display camera on the cover, well, yeah, that's going to look a whole heap of a lot better, but you would probably prefer to just use the primary sensor and use your camera like this, where you actually open up the camera and then click on this handy button right there, which actually turns your cover display on. But then you can actually go one further and click on selfie up there, and now you can actually control the camera fully from that cover display. So you could then turn this thing around and take a selfie. I've got a couple of samples of that as well, which is what we have here. And you get really nice detail. I believe this might have been portrait mode. Maybe this wasn't portrait. No, this wasn't portrait mode, actually. I think this was just the natural blur. You can tell because my hair isn't doing anything super weird like it normally does. So being able to flip it around and use that is really nice. There is portrait mode actually being used, and there is the ultra wide lens, so you can use that as well. So there's a lot of good versatility there if you use it like that. I haven't touched on battery life yet, and it's been fairly consistent for me. It's not phenomenal, not the most amazing battery life in the world, but for something with this large of a screen running at 120 hertz, it is pretty impressive. This is a pretty normal looking day for me here. You can see that I had almost 6 hours of screen on time, 5 hours and 42 minutes, and another 8.5 hours of screen off time. So that's a pretty decent day without charging. But you will see that a lot of other days, I will wind up charging somewhere in the middle and then using it more. Or, you can see there charging in the middle, topping it off. Yesterday, I was on my phone way too much, and I basically murdered this thing before I was having to plug it in at like 2 or 3 o'clock and then charge it and use it for the rest of the day. So it is totally possible to murder this thing's battery before you get to the end of the day. But generally speaking, 4 to 6 hours of screen time has been what I've been getting. Probably 5 to 6 is probably more accurate. A little bit better than I got on my Duo 2, which was more like 4 to 6, but leaning on the other side of 5 hours. This is kind of leaning on the other side of 5 hours. So pretty solid. I mean, that day that I was out at that park taking a ton of pictures, wasn't really worried about the battery there very much. Got me through that whole trip just fine. So where does that leave us overall a month in? I think it's a fantastic device. For $1,800, that is a pretty steep asking price, and that's going to be something you have to decide on your own whether or not it's worth that. For me, I don't think it's worth $1,800. You know, that being said, I did some trade-ins towards it and got a bunch of freebies, got a watch, got some earbuds, got a case, and paid about $1,000. So at that point, yeah, I think it was absolutely worth getting for me. It's a very, very good device. If you want something that has a good camera, good battery life, a decent cover display, but a really nice inner display for either watching content or just seeing stuff on a bigger screen, multitasking is a great option there. Maybe you don't like the dual screen thing with Surface Duo, but you still want to multitask a bunch. All really good reasons to potentially pick up the Galaxy Z Fold 4. Guys, if you are new here, don't forget to subscribe on your way out. I will see you on the next one. And until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.